What's up, you scholars of enlightenment? So, according to the World Health Organization, as of May 22nd, more than 250 confirmed and suspected cases of monkeypox have been reported in 16 countries worldwide. Now, what is monkeypox? How can we combat it? Should we be overly concerned? These are very important and pressing questions, and that is why I've got my excellent special guest, Professor Jason Kindrachuk, back today to discuss. Jason, how are you doing?
Yeah, I don't think you should ask virologists, especially people that work in emerging viruses, how they're doing anymore. Just say,
Okay.
you're going to be okay. Like that. That's
How
you know,
bad is
a
this
soft.
week relative to
Yeah,
other weeks recently?
this week's picking up, right? Listen, I think for people that have worked on, certainly that have worked on pox viruses, we're more concerned than we've been for a long time, right? And that also appreciates what happened in 2003 during the U.S. outbreak. We haven't had to, I think, considerably worry globally about pox viruses for a long time, certainly post 1980, when smallpox was announced to be eradicated. We knew that monkeypox was brewing in the background, but I think there was a feeling that at the very least we could keep it somewhat contained. Now what we're seeing is the unfortunate reality of what viruses do. They like to hitch rides on people, and they like to move around with air travel and all kinds of other travel. So what you end up having is a conduit for viruses to move, and now you start to get a feeling of, okay, what happens when it goes into different populations? What does spread and transmission look like within different populations and within different situations? All these things are I think we're trying to understand as quickly as we can.
Yeah.
It's never fast enough, but I think we're doing what we can.
There's definitely, as you kind of allude to, kind of depressing that this thing has been brewing in the background, like you say, in Africa. Nobody seems to care because it's not been on our radar. It knocks on our door, and suddenly everyone's up in arms. Why haven't we done something about this? What's going on? Seems to be the same tale over and over again. And I think we'll get into that a little bit. So, just for the viewers out there, Professor Kindrachuk is a professor of medical microbiology and infectious diseases at the University of Manitoba, where his research focuses on the circulation, transmission, and pathogenesis of emerging viruses that pose a global threat to global human and animal health. And these have included Ebola viruses, coronaviruses, and influenza viruses. And he is a pox virus specialist. So who better to help us understand what's going on? So Jason, we spoke a little bit about monkeypox last week when we covered the cases of hepatitis in young children, and the cases are going up. What's the current status? Where are we seeing cases, and how many?
Yeah, I think we continue to see expansion of cases across the globe, right? Certainly the UK is seeing an increase in cases. Here in Canada, we're seeing an increase in cases as well. The US, things have been, somewhat quiet. Some of that may be due to waiting for confirmation on testing.
Yeah.
But really the patterns are continuing to emerge. And as people will look more and more diagnostically for cases, they're probably going to identify them. So we've now seen spread, at least for cases that have been reported in more than 20 countries. You already alluded to more than 200 cases. This is big. And the issue is that it's not going to slow down or stop overnight. So even if things start to kind of hit a peak and we start to see things subside, it's going to take a while for that freight train to stop. So I think for the next bit, we're going to continue to hear about accumulations.
And it does look, unfortunately, like we've got community transmission, doesn't it? At least in the UK, we had this case that surfaced on May 7th. Of a person who travelled to Nigeria and apparently contracted monkeypox. Then a week later, we had 2 additional cases in London. Then we had 4 additional people who didn't seem to be related in any way epidemiologically to the original person. So it does look, unfortunately, like there's some chains of transmission that are happening at the community level. Is that fair from what we're
no, that is fair, certainly. And I think we have to also appreciate that listen, monkeypox has been around for a long time. And certainly we're going to talk about that. We've seen travel-related cases in the past. That side of this is not new. It's more the community transmission aspect, certainly outside of West and Central Africa and outside of 2003, which has made this quite different. So I think certainly we're getting more signs of community transmission. A lot of this now is going to be how to figure out how to contain those cases, and also how to try and get people protected, in particular those that are close contacts or those that are healthcare workers that are dealing with these cases.
I definitely want to make it clear, and I'm sure you do at a kind of early stage. There's no idea of trying to sensationalize anything here or make people scared. We just want to discuss exactly what's going on. And as you mentioned, there's been outbreaks in the past, and they have been brought under control quite quickly. So we can be hopeful at this stage, but we need to be vigilant. So as you kind of said, monkeypox, it's not a new virus, is it? It's been around for a long time. So tell us a little bit about sort of the history of monkeypox and how is it related to other viruses that people might be more familiar with?
Sure. I think, immediately when we hear monkeypox and we hear those last three letters, your mind immediately goes to smallpox. Yeah. And there's some value in that and also some detriment in that. I mean, part of this is, yes, this is a virus that's related to variola virus, which is the causal agent of smallpox, also related to cowpox and vaccinia virus, which can also cause disease in humans. These are all members of the Poxviridae family of viruses. They're large DNA viruses, very, very complex, in most cases with 200 genes or more. Compare that back to something like Ebola with 7 genes. You start to get an idea of the complexity. Monkeypox was first identified in 1958. It was identified in non-human primates, which ultimately led to the naming of monkeypox. But monkeys are not, at least at this point, do not seem to be the reservoir. There are certainly other animals that can be infected. 1970, first identification of a human case, and over 5 decades later, we have seen continual transmission. And certainly endemicity within West and Central Africa. So we've appreciated, I think, for a long period of time that monkeypox was an issue. We've also had to, I think, increase our concern based on the fact that with each passing year, we lose more of that long-term smallpox immunity, certainly in regards to people that happen to pass away that were previously immunized. Yep. Younger people that are born are not going to be immunized. So all of these things have cascaded now very much into what we're seeing today.
That's very interesting regarding what I wanted to come on to with the potential timing of this outbreak. There's a lot of things that have sort of come to a head. I want to cover one thing very quickly of what you mentioned. So you talked about some of the relationship between the viruses. There have been, unfortunately, as always happens with medical issues nowadays, a lot of people who want to say certain things perhaps without knowing much about these viruses. Some people have tried to say that this isn't really a thing. It's just chickenpox rebadged, or it's shingles rebadged, for example. Any kind of comment on that? We've seen people mentioning, that the same picture has been used for shingles and monkeypox on a couple of websites, so therefore it's just all the same thing.
My comment on this is very much a thing, right? And again, this is not a brand new virus. So let's remove ourselves from this idea that, this is something that we've just come up with over the last few weeks. There's 5 decades plus of work that's gone into monkeypox. Certainly historically, you can go back through that data, you can go back through work by Frederick Fenner and D.A. Henderson and others who were unbelievably important in the smallpox eradication program, who also talked about the concerns regarding monkeypox. So this is very much something we need to be concerned about. Now, again, much like other diseases, there are phases of monkeypox that are similar to other diseases. We've seen that certainly even early symptoms of Ebola can look like influenza in some cases in those very early stages. Doesn't mean it's influenza. It means that it shares some symptoms in common, but it doesn't mean that they're the same. Monkeypox, same thing. There are similarities with other diseases, but this is a distinct virus, causes a distinct disease, and certainly is of heightened concern given the case fatality rates that have been associated with this.
And we're definitely going to come on to that. So you mentioned kind of briefly there, where do we usually find monkeypox? You mentioned the first human case, I think it was in 1970 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Is that correct?
Yeah. So most of the cases have been centered within Central and West Africa, right? And that really gives rise to the West African and Congo Basin or Central African clades of monkeypox virus, which we'll talk about, kind of 2 different flavors of monkeypox that we've seen. So when we look across Central and West Africa, there are certainly, when we look at areas like Cameroon, we look at areas like Nigeria, even moving into further west of of the continent of Africa, we see many areas that have an endemic state with monkeypox virus. They have certainly have annual outbreaks or cases, and they've been monitoring for those for many years. The issue has been much of that data has been limited in regards to clinical symptomology, underlying immunity, relation to to transmission. We have good data, but we're still learning very much what this virus is and how it behaves.
So two distinct kind of variants: the West African variant, as it's called, and the Congo Basin variant, which is more in Central Africa. Is that due to geography, or is there any special reason why we got these two variants, or is it just how the evolution has happened?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. This is exactly where I kind of carved my eye teeth as a virologist, was going in and looking at West African monkeypox virus. The West African clade tends to have a lower case fatality rate, seems to be less severe. It's what's associated with the current outbreak that we're seeing, and then as well the 2003 outbreak. Congo Basin, more severe, right? We start seeing case fatality rates approaching 10%, maybe a little bit more, and been associated with more severe disease. So the question to me in 2009, and I think to many others, was, okay, distinct symptoms seem to be related to these two different clades. Is there anything underlying the different genes or the different presentation of genes within the viral genomes that are distinctly different? We do see that, right? Certainly some of our data was able to show there's differences in how these two clades can activate cell death or apoptosis in infected cells. We've seen certainly in animal model experiments, there are differences in severity. So there are underlying differences that have been based just through the evolution of this virus. How that plays out over the long term, whether we see continual evolution, I think we're still, very much in the infancy of that. But pox viruses have a lot of genes, right? So they come armed to the teeth, all ready to the fight.
Interesting, and as you said, fortunately, perhaps the spread that we've seen in a more international sense has been related to the West African clade, which, as you said, does seem to have a lower case fatality rate. So that is good news, if that's the right word to use out of those two, I guess. What are the symptoms and impacts of monkeypox? Because you mentioned that sometimes they have similar symptomology to other viruses. We've all seen I don't want to kind of go on it too much, because we've all seen the pustules and the scabs, and it's not a particularly nice thing to look at. It's something we have to look at because we have to understand this virus. But what is the symptomology, and how does it progress once you contract this unfortunate virus?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So we always talk about this incubation state of viruses, right? So when we talk about incubation states, the virus is getting a foothold within the organism. It's starting to create copies of itself, but we don't see that initiation of a strong antiviral or immune response where you start to see symptoms of disease or fever. So that period typically lasts 6 to 13 days, but can range anywhere from 5 to 21. So that during that period of time, you don't know you're infected. But when we look at least at historical data, it also appears that people are likely not transmitting during that period. Again, weigh that back with all the data that we have so far. So things could change, but so far historically, that's what we've seen. Now what you see is after that incubation phase, is you start to hit that prodromal phase, which is where you actually get those initial symptoms of disease. And again, very much kind of influenza-like, right? So fever, malaise, lethargy, muscle aches and pains, but you don't see any signs of rash. So these are kind of the initial symptoms of saying, oh, something's going on. Those days typically last somewhere between 1 and 3 days, or the range is about 1 to 5 days. And after that prodromal period is when the rash starts. And that's where you start to see the rash and then the subsequent pustule development, right? The prodromal phase, there's data that suggests that people potentially could be symptomatic, not symptomatic, but could be transmitting virus, could be contagious at that point, but it's not very well fleshed out. Certainly when people get into that rash phase and start to get into pustule development, that is where we start to see, the real significance, I think, of transmission, because of the fact you have these outward lesions that are chock full of virus. Ultimately, those lesions will heal. They'll scab over. So for people that have gotten a smallpox vaccine or the ACAM 2000 vaccine, you get that characteristic pustule, and it goes through different stages of development. Ultimately, it hardens and it crusts and it falls off. Those crusts, though, and that scab still have infectious virus. So again, we have this period where it's very, very lengthened in terms of 2 to 3 weeks, where you're waiting for that lesion to heal up and scab over and then fall off. But by the way, during that period, you're still contagious. And I think the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that when you look at patients that have monkeypox, there's a characteristic development of lesions. It kind of spreads from the face to the arms, legs, hands, and feet. So you get this kind of centrifugal development of lesions. And all the lesions on the different parts and different regions of the body will develop at the same time. So the pustule development on the face will match what you're seeing on the arms, on the hands, and on the legs and on the feet.
I think we've that probably tallies well with what we've seen going on in the world. So in Belgium, I think they've introduced the first quarantine for monkeypox cases. They said around 21 days, which I guess is kind of trying to be a couple of standard deviations above the usual period that somebody would be infectious. Is that kind of on this diagram? They're just saying let's try and have a little bit of leeway, I guess, so that people aren't passing this on.
Well, it is, right? And I think one of the things we have to consider as well is, even as that scab develops and starts to fall off, is where does that infectious period lie? And I think you want to have a little bit of kind of a bridge or a barrier around that, so that if people are potentially still infectious or that scab hasn't completely fallen off, that they don't go on and transmit virus. Again, we understand a lot about transmission of pox viruses. Let's be completely upfront about that there's, we have thousands of years for smallpox that we've learned from, certainly with cowpox, monkeypox, vaccinia, we know a lot. It's more right now in the way that monkeypox is spreading, we're trying to determine very quickly, how is the transmission looking, and what can we do to try and get this contained as quickly as possible.
Yeah. And you mentioned very briefly the rates that we see in terms of the case fatality rates. How deadly is monkeypox, and how good of a handle do we get on that? Because you mentioned we have some data, but maybe we don't have a complete picture of what's going on. There's a lot of confounding factors as well. What's the sort of best estimate of those sort of case fatality rates?
Well, one of the things I think we need to appreciate, there's always going to be some noise, especially if we're looking at the global south and we're looking at decades of data. We have to appreciate many of these regions have not necessarily had the ability to either do good surveillance or do good reporting until even the last few years. That's made it difficult because, again, we're learning and we're trying to talk to experts in those areas to learn, but we also are trying to understand what case fatalities look like, not necessarily with all the data that we can have. If we look at West African clade, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1% to 3%, but I think we can also look back at 2003 and look at the US outbreak and say, you know what, in all those cases, we didn't see any fatalities. And so far, things have looked okay for what we've seen going on across the globe. It's looked fairly mild, though we've seen certainly some cases with more moderate or severe disease. Congo Basin, a little bit different, right? More severe disease, case fatality rate is higher. Again, I think what we have to appreciate is, do we have all the data we need in terms of people that maybe have mild illness that haven't necessarily been reported? The other side is that when we talk about case fatality rates, we also have to keep this in perspective, right? So case fatality rates for both West African clade and Central African or Congo Basin clade, both higher certainly than what we've seen with COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2. But let's also consider and think about the transmission and the number of cases we see, right? So case fatality rate tells us one part, but the number of cases and ultimately the number of fatalities that come out of it tell us another picture too in terms of impact.
Yeah. Is it hard to trust those numbers, because there's a hell of a lot of confounding things in a Western perspective, at least, is better healthcare and different transmission chains and these kind of things. So it's hard to kind of take those numbers, and we don't want to take those numbers and just scare people with, if you get this,
Yeah.
1 in 10 is going to die. Oh no, everything's kind of terrible. Is it? We can't just transplant those numbers onto the current outbreak, can we? And run with them.
No, I think we always have to talk about the nuance, right? And again, as somebody who was, in West Africa in 2014 and has worked a lot on Ebola, this has been one of the things that we've always faced, right? Case fatality rate, we hear, 50%, or in some outbreaks up to 90%. But what we don't tend to talk about is, oh, by the way, those are localized very much in regions that have a lack of healthcare infrastructure, that have a lack of accessibility. If you transfer that to high-income areas of the world, those case fatality rates still high, but they drop significantly. Yeah. So we need to continue to appreciate that nuance when we have these conversations.
Makes sense. So you talked about the transmission there. I've seen a lot of people talking about this. We mentioned it last week, that this is something that's passed on by close proximity, potentially sharing of body fluids, potentially sharing bedding or towels with an infected individual. Is there anything else to say on that? I've seen some people coming out and saying, this thing is incredibly stable in the air and we should be incredibly worried about aerosol transmission, and it's basically similar to COVID transmission chains. This seems a little bit overblown. Is that fair?
Well, again, we get into the controversy of routes of transmission, right? And certainly when we talk about respiratory transmission, get into aerosols and droplets, and where do we lie with this disease? I would first of all harken back to the fact 50 plus years that we've been monitoring monkeypox. Doesn't mean things couldn't have changed, but so far at least, what the data that we have, again, thankfully very much to our colleagues in West and Central Africa that have continued to provide us information, the majority of transmission appears to be through primarily close contact or respiratory droplets. But again, those droplets are based on increased exposure time with people that are in close contact. If you look back to 2003, we gained quite a bit of information from the U.S. In regards to the majority of transmission appear to be mostly from infected prairie dogs to people. We didn't see a lot of human-to-human transmission. That all of that is important. Doesn't mean that there's not the potential for an aerosol route, but we have to again look back at the information we have and say, okay, historically, what has worked for containment? And then, by the way, what have we learned certainly from animal models of infection that can potentially be transferred over or help guide our recommendations for humans? So I think you're seeing certainly in regards to healthcare workers, recommendations are always going to be, I think, at the highest level of protection for people, especially if they're dealing with patients that are quite sick and quite ill. For people in the home, I think those recommendations, you're going to continue to hear those come out. And a lot of that's going to be based around that proximity, how to help kind of stop that transmission through droplets. But also, by the way, this other aspect, which is fomites and contaminated bedding or soiled linens. All of those things are something that potentially can impact transmission, and we need to definitely consider.
And we should be careful at this stage, shouldn't we? Because we mentioned it briefly last week when we kind of teed up monkeypox. There's been some link between the spread of the virus and men who have sex with men, that kind of community. And we need to be careful at the moment that that's not just a subset of close proximity. We can't say that this is a virus that's associated with one particular group or one particular country or whatever it might be. We want to understand if there's any potential epidemiological link there, but we have to be careful to get that balance, don't we, between creating a stigma on certain groups when it's actually more about close proximity than anyone's sexual proclivities, for example.
Well, 100%, right? And I think part of this conversation too goes back to certainly we've heard the unfortunate discussion about having this stigmatize the men who have sex with men community. That through close contact, including sexual contact, the virus can likely transmit. That doesn't mean that it is only impacting those communities. It just means that it's been able to find a foothold, at least in the early transmission cases that we've seen. But let's also again think about the historical aspect, which is much of the discussion about monkeypox has always been around the fact that, well, this is localized to West and Central Africa, and I think for many years has ultimately led to it being a neglected or forgotten disease. All of these things, all of these stigmas that we have impact our ability to be responsive and be prepared. And I think we're now starting to see the unfortunate reality of what happens when we have let that kind of drive our responsiveness and our mindset for many years.
That's a really nice segue into kind of what I wanted to mention. So the question I had was, why are we starting to see? I'll get my link up. I think it's over here. Why are we starting to see? This is the one I'm actually looking for. Is there any understanding of why this outbreak is occurring roughly now? Because people will point to all sorts of things. Oh, it looks like it's coming just after COVID. Is it, could it be anything like weakened immune systems? Is it just chance that the transmission chains got going? Is it, people have talked about greater surveillance that we kind of pushed back on last week. Is there any understanding of why now?
Well, I think we have to appreciate that in the background of all this, listen, viruses are very opportunistic, right? So if there's any sort of cracks in the system, they're going to exploit that. And we have to think about this. Listen, COVID has been one aspect of this where maybe, there are more people traveling now, and there's been an increased preponderance of people wanting to go to international locations because they can again. Has there been a decreased sense of personal protection because we felt that we've gone through this? The messaging was guiding us to say COVID-19 is over, and we started to forget about some of those aspects. All of this likely plays into it. But I think we also need to appreciate, listen, the increases in incidence of monkeypox is nothing that is new, right? This is something, again, for decades now, there's been an increasing incidence that's been recognized. Sure, it was localized within fairly specific areas of the world. But that incidence and that increase certainly has been setting off alarm bells within the emerging virus community for a while and saying, hey, we're already seeing travel-related cases. We saw what happened in 2003. We need to be thinking about the fact that, listen, increased globalization, decreased immunity in the population, all of these things are going to potentially drive the movement of viruses. Plus, on top of that, let's appreciate again for a second, smallpox was a disease that was unique specifically to humans. There was no animal reservoir when that virus was eradicated. For monkeypox, we don't know the animal reservoir, right? There are a number of species that can be infected. That complicates this issue even more.
It's very interesting what you said, because again, I come back to the same point that I made at the start. This has been going on in Africa, and people just sort of haven't shone enough light on it. There's been, brilliant people working over there and understanding it. But for us, mostly in the West, we've been able to just ignore it. I think you mentioned rising cases. There's a case in Nigeria, for example, 550 suspected cases in 2017. So it's been growing, and some of the reasons that they've been given is population growth, more settlements near forests. So like you were talking, animal reservoirs, increased interaction with those animals. Higher
climate change,
all higher population density, right? All of these things sort of coming to a head that people have kind of been able to ignore. And one thing you mentioned at the top, which was one of the main things that when I read this, was actually the decreasing fraction of people who are now vaccinated against smallpox because they don't actually need to be. Could you speak very briefly to that?
Yeah, I'll try. I get loquacious, but I'll try and kind of keep it brief. So let's consider just the African continent for a second, right? So 1977 is the end of the smallpox vaccination campaign in the continent. The year I was born, so that means people that were 45 or older were vaccinated. We also have to consider life expectancy. So life expectancy across the continent, somewhere in the range of the mid 60s. So there basically is this continually decreasing population of people that have any underlying immunity through vaccination. And by the way, that vaccination is now 4+ decades old. So when we think about this idea of immunity against monkeypox, and we think about how vaccination against smallpox provides us some protection, it does, but that is continually decreasing. And by the way, we don't know what that long-term protection looks like. We're learning now. We're going to get some pretty quick idea of what this looks like on the global scale. But certainly this has been something that we've been concerned about for a long period of time. Waning immunity is going to have an impact on monkeypox transmission and patterns of spread.
And they mentioned that even in these papers that you can actually monitor the rising age of the people who are contracting monkeypox, which tracks perfectly with the sort of waning levels of immunity. So a hell of a lot of things that people have been warning about and people have been aware of that could potentially have come to a head here, and we need to understand all of these things and how they've come together, and how they are coming together in Africa and more broadly. You mentioned this earlier, and I think it's important for people to understand the precedent of a monkeypox spread outside of Africa. So 2003 in the US, we had an outbreak. How did that occur, and how was it brought under control? Because it seems to be something that people just don't know about, because I guess it was a small outbreak and it was covered and people just have a short memory for these things.
I think the short memory is a big part of this, right? And listen, I laugh whenever it comes up instinctively, because my mind immediately goes to the name Phil's Pocket Pets, which for people that have studied this understand what it is. It basically, there was essentially kind of an underground animal trade group or person that kind of went by the moniker Phil's Pocket Pets. And what ended up happening was there was a trade of prairie dogs, and there's basically a traveling, kind of animal trade. What happened is that animals came over from West Africa. Some of those animals obviously were carrying the virus. We don't specifically know which ones, although I think the data seems to point towards Gambian pouch rats. Potentially, those animals were able to transmit the virus to prairie dogs. Prairie dogs, we didn't know were a really good intermediate host for this virus. They actually are. And people that had contact with those animals ended up getting monkeypox infections. It was contained very, very quickly, right? And I think the thing that we need to keep in mind, again, is, listen, fast recognition, fast containment, and isolation of cases led to getting this situation under control in the Midwest of the U.S. very, very quickly. The unfortunate reality is that 2003, so nearly 2 decades ago, and most people forget that happened. So we've seen it. We need to learn how they contained it during that time frame, and again, use that for what we're doing now in terms of guidance.
Yes, unfortunately, people do forget, and then we have the same problem over again. So talking about that outbreak leading into how prepared are we for this outbreak, and how can we get it under control? Because the current messaging seems to be, look, we can get this under control, right? It's obviously a serious thing that we need to be vigilant about, but we can get this under control. We have certain tools in our arsenal without going to, mandatory quarantines or lockdowns. We do have vaccination. We do have certain therapeutics. In terms of the vaccines, you mentioned that we have the smallpox vaccine. Obviously, that hasn't been used for a while. How effective is that? And do we need to look at our stocks if that's something that we haven't used for a while?
Yeah, so I mean, when we think about smallpox vaccines, I think we immediately go back to the idea of dry vax. We have to appreciate that, we've moved away from, kind of those, first and second generation vaccines into better vaccines. So like I'm vaccinated with ACAM 2000. I was vaccinated because I worked with monkeypox and worked fairly closely. It's still a live vaccinia virus, right? So the impact of that vaccine is for people that have underlying health issues like being immunocompromised, or who have atopic dermatitis, or who have eczema. Those people are refractory from being able to get vaccinated because of the potential for additional complications. But we've now seen with the Jynneos vaccine that we have a non-replicating vaccine. Seems to work very well. So far, it looks like those vaccines provide, I think it's 85% protection against monkeypox or better. Those things are important for us, right? And again, let's appreciate these are single dose vaccines. So yes, I was boosted because of the type of work that I was doing. But most people will get a single dose vaccine will actually have quite a bit of protection. So you're starting to see the rollout of vaccines in some countries to healthcare workers, to close contacts, going back through that ring vaccination strategy, again, building off of the data that we have from smallpox, which again, the greatest infectious disease that's impacted humans ever. we've learned a lot from that. So we have good tools. Now it's a question of where do you roll those tools out?
Yeah.
And by the way, how do you, I think, message back to contacts or people that have potentially been in contact with infectious patients on what symptoms to recognize and get them comfortable with self-reporting?
Makes sense. So I think in that article they were saying they're looking at refreshing the stocks as well for some of these vaccines. As you say, there's been rollouts to immunocompromised people, healthcare workers, people who definitely need it. So far, nothing more widely than that. But we do have certain vaccines that seem to work very well. In terms of therapeutics, there are also a few as well, aren't they? I saw. If I can not butcher the names, Cidofovir, Brincidofovir, and Tecovirimat. There's a few therapeutics that we have for people who've already, and antivirals for people who have already, unfortunately, caught the virus, don't we?
Yeah, and again, let's appreciate that. Brincidofovir and Tecovirimat, which I know formally as ST246, back from
that would have been easier to say.
That would have been much easier, right? That's why I always use that name. We've had years of research on both of those therapeutics, and part of this is because in the background there is still advisory committees on variola virus research. We still have 2 areas of the world that have stocks of variola virus for smallpox research. So there's been a concern always about we need to have vaccines and we need to have therapeutics in the event that there was ever an unintentional release or a sudden resurgence in smallpox. So all of the data for both of these 2 therapeutics have gone through I think a litany of analysis by researchers and by organizations across the world. They're good therapeutics. Vaccination still will help us get this controlled. And by the way, getting vaccines out to the areas where these viruses are endemic will get us into longer term control.
Yeah, and hopefully that's the upshot of what we see from this is that because we've now had to deal with it, we can actually have some compassion that we, even from an entirely selfish perspective, this is something that we need to get a hand on. And obviously, from a more compassionate perspective, we should probably do it anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there a way to test for monkeypox? So we've obviously seen with COVID, people can take rapid tests and find out pretty much within a couple of minutes whether they probably have COVID. Is there any similar thing for monkeypox, or is this a case of being vigilant about the symptoms and presenting yourself to a doctor if you're overly concerned?
Yeah, it's a combination, right? So certainly PCR testing is available for monkeypox virus, and again, appreciating that this is something that we've looked for a long period of time, and people that have traveled as well as in other cases, and certainly the 2003 outbreak. So we have good PCR testing. It's a matter of getting ensuring that everybody has those PCR tests and has those capacities available. And there's the kind of the classical clinical symptoms. We do have a pretty good idea of what this disease looks like. So even while you're waiting for those PCR results to come back, at the very least, the clinical symptoms allow you to be able to do some characterization, given the differences we see between, say, monkeypox and chickenpox or other kind of vesicular based diseases.
So I guess, and it's a little bit of an open question, and I appreciate that, and a little bit subjective. But if we sort of wrap up everything we know so far, the current state of best knowledge with this outbreak, how concerned should we be at this stage? Is this just a case of being vigilant and getting a handle on it, and not, we don't need to be in a state of panic? What sort of level should we be at with this at the moment?
Well, it's difficult, right? Because listen, we're kind of back into that COVID realm right now, where either this is kind of the end of times, or this is nothing and potentially it's fake, right? That middle ground has kind of been lost. As an emerging virus person, I live in potential concern, right? Because you're always thinking, okay, we know that these outbreaks are going to happen. We know spillover events are going to happen. When are they going to take place? How prepared are we? With monkeypox, we have a couple things going for us. One is we have decades of research and certainly clinical management, understanding how to deal with monkeypox cases. We also have been somewhat fortunate in that so far, West African clade is all that we've seen.
Yeah.
That's important because now we're dealing at least with the less severe form, although it in itself can still be severe. In terms of spread, we have certainly good historical data to be able to say, hey, get cases identified, get them contained. You can likely knock down those levels of community transmission. All of those things play into us being able to get this under control. So I don't think we need to look at this as being a new pandemic or that this is going to become the new pandemic. But let's also be concerned. Right now, there are cases that are still moving through the community. We still have to get people to identify those cases and self-identify. And we need to be cautious about the fact there are people that are immunocompromised, women that are pregnant, kids that are at a heightened risk of severe disease. So we need to be extremely vigilant at this point in time.
Is that the main unknown that virologists want to get a handle on at the moment? That exact idea of what transmission chains are passing this around and what the epidemiology is? Is that the kind of main unknown at the moment?
Yeah, I think a big part of it right now is we want to know has anything changed in the transmissibility of this West African colitis compared to what we've seen previously, and as well, certainly I think get an idea of how vigilant do we need to be in terms of our recommendations for containment and things like personal protective equipment to be able to get this under control. Those things are going to be paramount right now for us to help kind of stop community transmission as well as we can.
If we were to be blasé about this, you mentioned that middle ground's kind of been lost, and I completely agree with you. We're gonna finish off by talking about a couple of the kind of talking points that have been going around, and that middle ground has definitely been lost. If we take the route of being, we're washed out with COVID, we don't want to do much about this, and we're very blasé about this, what is the likely sort of end note with this? That it could go into a potentially another animal reservoir, and then we're stuck with this being endemic at low levels in the West as well? What's the kind of end game with this?
That concern, I think, is definitely one of the most important, right? I mean, this is predominantly a self-limiting disease, but we know it can have big impacts. We don't want to see continual circulation in our communities. But there is this other aspect, which, much like we saw with SARS-CoV-2, as we move through the pandemic, monkeypox, we know, can move in other species. And by the way, we don't necessarily know what all those species look like. It's opportunistic. It's been able to do this in the past. So the question becomes, what happens if it moves into to wild animal populations or captive animal or companion animal populations? And what does that mean for ongoing transmission, in particular within other areas of the world that are in the global south, where they have not necessarily had monkeypox? Those are the things that, to me, we need to be very, very concerned about. We can't continue to think about infectious diseases and emerging viruses just from the auspice of human health. This is truly global human and animal health that we need to consider.
I've got a couple of questions. How is your time, Jason? Because I'm just aware of you.
I'm good.
Are you sure?
I'm good.
Right, okay, good.
Yeah.
Because I want to be respectful of your time and not just keep going forever. Because I want to look at a couple of the conspiracies, but because we're live, some people are putting some questions. If you're happy to address
absolutely.
Those. So Arjun has asked, how often does the virus change its main form of transmission? Has there been? You've obviously been looking at this at monkeypox for a long time. Has it changed much over that 5 decades of study, or has it remained similar in the way that it transmits and the way that it presents?
It's been pretty stable, okay? And again, let's appreciate that. Yeah, from 1970 on, we've identified monkeypox. Our epidemiology data is certainly not, reaching that far back, or it's a little bit sparse during those early years. But all the data that we have, again, has suggested that close contact, droplets in some cases, close extended contact. We haven't seen any sudden changes. And I would, again, it's not that it can't happen, but let's appreciate that certainly, pox viruses have a very large arsenal. They're very good at what they do. So I think part of this is, has there been any reason for the virus or any push for the virus to have changed evolutionarily? This could be a concern for us.
We don't want to give it any chances to change up its weaponry and its arsenal.
No, let's hedge our bets and be careful with what we have now.
Makes sense. A couple of questions. I think I can probably roll them together. One from Arjun again, and one from Merve, I think. How much is it transmissible before the pox is visible? And someone's also said, can it be transmitted asymptomatically? Which I guess are basically the same question. Do people need to be concerned about passing this on before we start to see the symptoms that we've seen lots of pictures of?
Sure, it's a good question, right? And going back again to CDC, WHO, all historical data that we've had on monkeypox, there certainly is, I think, some concern that it potentially can transmit during that prodromal period when people are starting to get a fever and starting to feel unwell. So I think that's where there needs to be some consideration, again, of looking at symptoms before rash develops. If you're feeling unwell, let's be cautious, especially if you've had close contact with somebody that's potentially been a positive case. The asymptomatic transmission question is much bigger, and I think it's something that certainly is being looked at right now, is whether or not there have been any signs of asymptomatic transmission. Again, going back to Ebola, there has been discussion whether or not there have been people that have been refractory to symptom development and have still been able to contribute to chains of transmission. That data is very hard to try and tease apart, especially if you're looking at historical epidemiology data, especially if it's from areas that haven't had great surveillance. So I think we need to be cautious. We haven't necessarily seen that in the past as being a driving force of monkeypox transmission, but let's appreciate monkeypox is also moving in a different way than we've seen before, i.e., across the globe right now.
And then the final question I've got is from Lionel, and he says, are we looking at a situation where everyone is going to end up having to get the, I guess what is essentially the smallpox vaccine again? Yeah. So he says he's quite old and he had it back in the day and has a scar. Is that where we might be heading?
It's a good question, right? Listen, I don't think so. Right. And I'm always cautious because I don't want to say, no,
you don't want it to be clipped up and say, you said this wasn't going to happen. Yeah.
I don't think so, right? Based on what we know about monkeypox, listen, this virus has had decades, certainly, to move globally into a much larger venue, and it hasn't done that so far. So I think we can appreciate that basic containment can get this virus under control. That's what's worked in the past. Vaccination certainly is going to be important for healthcare workers and for close contacts in being able to try and keep those, those chains of transmission contained. But I don't think we're at a point yet where we need to be considering doing global vaccination.
Yeah, very good, excellent. So I think that kind of is a really nice explanation of everything kind of people need to know. And thank you so much for taking the time with that, Jason. I want to, if you're game to do it, I want to tackle a couple of the conspiracies and kind of sensationalism that's going around to finish up.
Let's do it.
It's kind of sad that we have to do this, I guess, but I think what we're seeing is exactly what you put your hand on. Or your finger on, excuse me. There's kind of two sides of this kind of non-scientific debate that's going on your Twitters, your Facebooks, and elsewhere. There's one side that thinks they're desperate to make it out to be the new pandemic and to get in at the ground level, to kind of clout chase about it and have a kind of extreme precautionary principle, I guess, if you like. And then on the other side, which gets seeded by that side, there's another group who think this is kind of a nothing disease. It's all made up. It's been legislated in because governments want more power, or they want to put in, some sort of new legislation, or the big pharma wants to sell more of their vaccines or therapeutics or whatever it might be. These seem to be the kind of two sides of the same coin, and both are incredibly unhelpful. And I want to just knock down a couple of those and a pox on both their houses, I guess. I've been waiting to use that for a while. So
well done.
I'll throw that one in there right now. So I want to start on the side of people who are being sort of, very sort of apocalyptic about this. One of them that we've heard about is massive growth. So I guess people sort of saying that we're seeing exponential growth. We've seen doubling of cases in 1.5 days. 27 times in 1 week. So increasing cases. Yeah. This has been labeled as misleading by a lot of people. Is this just because we're dealing with tiny numbers? We're also dealing with ascertainment bias, people not knowing exactly where the cases are or how many cases there are. So looking at the numbers and trying to fit an exponential to that seems a little bit of a bad way to go at the moment. Is that fair?
Yeah. I get very concerned when I see, certainly the 300 million cases in a month. Let's go back to 1950 with smallpox. We were looking at an estimated
I hadn't seen that. Sorry, I hadn't. I hadn't noticed the underneath.
I was really frustrated by this because gained 50 million cases per year in 1950 for smallpox. This was virus. This is the alpha virus of all time for humans. Let's understand, monkeypox is not smallpox. Okay, big concern, but not in that same league. So when we start talking about 300 million cases in a month, let's think about the reality of that situation, right? It doesn't fit any reality that we live in right now, nor that we've seen with this virus previously. So let's think about right now, all the noise that we're seeing in regards to cases. Countries are doing confirmation studying. We're seeing suspected cases, confirmed cases. Those are going to increase as more and more people certainly are getting tested and are starting to recognize that they may have symptoms. Those numbers are going to be very, very high immediately, and likely it's going to look like we have rampant growth. We're going to get a better picture over time of what this looks like. And again, this is not a brand new virus. Let's appreciate we've got decades and decades of data to tell us what we've seen so far in terms of R0 values and growth rates for monkeypox. So let's be very, very careful with our messaging, because again, if we feed this idea of sensationalism, what we end up doing is the people that are looking at this data and then feel as if they've been cheated or that they've been led astray, they're not necessarily going to listen to us when we need them to.
Exactly right. We need to keep the trust and be as nuanced as possible. The thing that really kind of upset me about seeing this is that this is exactly what we saw at the start of COVID, where kind of physicists, guilty as charged, sort of march in and they go, oh, I've got some numbers here. Oh, I can fit an exponential to it. Oh, this must be what's happening, without actually understanding all of the virological and epidemiological work that has to go into that and all the confounders that are there, because it's not their field of expertise. We need to wait and see exactly what we've got when we found all of the, or as many as the cases as we can get. The next one is very very typical. So J&J and AstraZeneca vaccines use a chimpanzee adenovirus vaccine vector, and the virus is called monkeypox. So we've seen a lot of people coming out and making a link between those two. Is there anything in that whatsoever? I'm guessing no, and I think we said no last week.
I'm trying to keep my expletives to a tolerable level. No, there isn't, right? Again, let's appreciate that adenoviruses are very different from pox viruses, and the two worlds are completely distinct. And also let's also appreciate that adenoviruses. We've got tons of data right now on adenoviruses that have been used in the population, certainly for COVID-19, but also for Ebola as well, since there's a licensed adenovirus vaccine based for that. This is nothing new. So let's go back to this idea that monkeypox, there is 50 years of literature dedicated to this particular virus. Let's not lose sight of all of that literature that we have, all that data that we have, because the greatest disgrace that it does is it decreases and delegitimizes the impact that we see on the global south and the areas that are highly impacted by this virus each and every day and each and every year.
And I mean, even with this, like you mentioned, the monkey name is kind of incidental. It spreads amongst many animals. So just doing
Absolutely.
that chimpanzee monkey, which is pretty spurious anyway in terms of evolution, is a very odd thing to do. And if we want to look at it in a wider context, vaccines basically eradicated smallpox. So
100%.
Doing this vaccine game is unfortunately very, very silly. The next one we've seen is obviously as would be expected. So this is more along the same line with the adenovirus. The next one we've seen, of course, is the Wuhan lab is back. So we saw that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I think it reproduced synthetically a fraction of the monkeypox genome. Is there anything here whatsoever? I've seen Angela and other people sort of address this, but Is there anything you can say about this so people will calm down?
The biggest thing that I would say is, listen, monkeypox in terms of research is not new, right? There are many labs across the globe that have worked or do currently work on monkeypox. I'm one of those people that was fortunate enough to be able to have worked on this in the past. This is not about, one distinct location in the world that has monkeypox. And by the way, again, let's go back to this idea. Monkeypox is endemic in Central and West Africa. So let's not forget about the fact that we've had, again, decades upon decades of endemic virus transmission. And by the way, travel movement of this virus out of those regions to try and fit some spurious theory that, oh, by the way, this is because of a lab leak across the world where we don't see monkeypox virus.
Yeah, it's very odd. This article I noticed a couple of days ago. It was called A Similar Story, like virus linked to Wuhan lab now in the West or something, and they've changed it to no, monkeypox didn't leak from Wuhan. The initial evidence suggests, which they've toned down a little bit, which they probably should just put didn't. But
yes,
there we go. So yes, we don't need to be playing that game with the Wuhan lab, but unfortunately, I think we're going to see that any time now. We see a viral leak. The final one seems to be that our friend Bill Gates never gets away without a mention. The final conspiracy seems to be that there was some sort of tabletop game or scenario that was highlighted by Bill Gates last year about a potential spread of a smallpox virus in the UK or wider afield. What was that tabletop game? Do you have any knowledge of that?
I don't have any knowledge, but all I would say again is that any sort of modeling that's been based off of first of all, if it's been based off of pox viruses, it's because smallpox was the greatest impact we've ever had on humans. But also, let's appreciate monkeypox again has been increasing in incidence. This is something that we have been concerned about. So it would make sense if you're going to model what transmission looks like in a global community. That would be one of the viruses you potentially might add in, just like you might add in Ebola or Nipah or like obviously SARS, other viruses that we've seen.
So it makes complete sense that virologists would be looking at this type of virus. And as we mentioned earlier, it's been growing in other areas of the world and has been flagged. People have been ringing the bell as a potential, more widely spreading virus. So the fact that people were looking at this and flagging it up last year, a couple of years ago, is nothing that we should be immediately think of as out of the ordinary.
No, I think you can look back at certainly researchers that have been doing this work for a long period of time, Anne Ramoen and others that have been doing amazing epidemiology work, Grant McFadden, those folks, David Evans, who've been doing a lot of molecular pox virology work, and certainly a lot of my colleagues. We've been doing this for a long time, right? So yet the public may not be completely up to date on what monkeypox is. Doesn't mean that this is not something we haven't been doing for many, many years.
I think, it's the old phrase, isn't it? That something that's new and something that's not understood is scary to people.
Absolutely.
So, but if you get the full context and you realize people have been working on this for a long time and it has been a growing concern, then that can hopefully alleviate some of these conspiracies and these concerns for people. And Jason, you're not part of a global conspiracy to spread monkeypox around and have Klaus Schwab and the WEF and take over people's lives, are you? I'll just ask you.
Listen,
I'll just ask you the question straight out. So
I am a moderately adequate prairie Canadian virologist. So we are an unassuming area of the world that I don't think a lot of people look to for grand conspiracies. Now, I work on emerging viruses. I very luckily happened to start working on monkeypox. It's unfortunate that this has become what it is. I hate the days that I actually take my expertise and now have to apply it to a global issue. I've done it with coronas. I've done it with Ebola. I've done it with flu. I've done it with monkeypox. I'm tired, man. I at some point, if I can own a fishing lodge and do that instead, 100%.
You will definitely have earned it. So I want to come off that and come on to the very final question that I had, because thank you so much for taking so much time. the wider context. This has been going on. It's been bubbling in Africa, as you said. You've been working on it for a long time. Hopefully, now that we've seen the impact in the West, we can start to think about that we need to get a handle on these things. This kind of one world health sort of idea that we see that viruses, outbreaks in different areas of the world have a knock-on impact for other countries. So we need to work together on these things. What would be kind of your wish list for what we should do regarding monkeypox, regardless of what happens in the West with these outbreaks, to kind of alleviate this virus in Africa? What can we do, and what should we be doing in your opinion?
There's a couple things, right? I mean, certainly investment in surveillance and research infrastructure within the areas where monkeypox is endemic is critical, right? The more information we have coming out of these regions where we know the virus is circulating, the more that we better understand how to be prepared and how to be responsive. The other side of that, though, is, by the way, we have good vaccines for this virus. We have good therapeutics. We need to be able to make those available. Yeah. We need to put the commitment in to working with locals and certainly the local community in regards to messaging and uptake and all these other things, because this is an issue. It's been an issue for decades. It's not going to go away overnight. So, and this applies beyond monkeypox to many other emerging viruses. So let's do the right thing and invest where we need to.
I mean, I just can't get over with COVID and now with this that, like I keep saying it, even from an entirely selfish perspective, you know, the outlay that we would have would probably be of benefit to ourselves. So
sure,
even if you don't want to look at it as a moral case and something that we could do to help people, just to help yourself, it seems like something that we should really be looking at. If we're talking about outbreaks in Africa, we're talking about, you know, cultural practices in China that maybe led to certain viruses. All these things that are going on around the world. You mentioned the word that viruses are opportunistic. They don't care about borders. They don't care about, you know, who you are. You're going to get infected if we give these things the opportunity to spread around the world. So we really need to get a handle on the emergence of these viruses, don't we?
I agree 100%. And I reflect back to 2014 because of the fact that just thinking about what the West African Ebola virus disease epidemic, the consequences of that globally in terms of economic consequences, we have to appreciate that outbreaks in very, very specific areas of the world now have a global effect. So when we talk about this idea of emerging viruses and surveillance and zoonotic transmission and being better prepared, the reason is because we are all going to be impacted inevitably. There's a moral and ethical standpoint, 100%, that we should be doing more. There's another standpoint too, which is, by the way, we're going to see the consequences of those if we don't be better prepared.
I think there was a final comment I've got. There was a paper recently, was it Colin Carlson and his group, who mentioned that this is only going to get worse with climate change, people moving, you know, expansion of human populations into areas where there's more animals, interactions with those animals, higher population density, you know, faster routes of travel into certain areas that haven't been explored. These things are only going to become more of an issue. So the faster we realize that we need to get a handle on these, we need to get the surveillance, we need to help out these areas with therapeutics, with vaccinations where possible. The sooner we get that through our heads and do something about it, I think it's going to be better for everyone. Is that fair?
Without question. Well said.
Awesome. All right, I will steal your last word then, and we'll take that as the last word. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to go through that with everyone. Everyone in the chat is so grateful for you taking the time to explain that so well and debunk some of the stuff we've seen on social media. I very much appreciate it. I've learned an awful lot. Is there anything that you want to say in closing, or anywhere that you'd like to point people to learn more about this?
No, listen, I would say it's an absolute pleasure. Listen, there for information, go into places like PubMed or Medline. If you want to learn about monkeypox, there are reams of papers, of publications and reviews that have looked at this for years. You know, folks like Inger Damon, Vicky Olson, Annie Ramoan, and others that have done unbelievable work. Let's just appreciate that in all of those papers, the overall message continues to say, We need to do better in terms of getting things under control, and we need to recognize this is a potential existential threat.
Amazing. Jason, thank you so much again. I'm going to let you go because we've taken up enough of your time. Thanks again, and have a fantastic weekend. Hopefully you'll get some rest.
Thank you.
Thanks, buddy. Take care.
Cheers.